Hello everyone, this is George from Ireland. This video is a tribute to the late Reverend Bill Sykes, and I found out that he died just over 4 years ago, as in that's what I discovered. So this is quite late. I've written about him before. So he died in January 2015, but it was over a month later when someone told me about it. He was the chaplain of UNIV, as in University College, Oxford. He was a cheery, chubby figure bouncing around the college, had bundles of energy, even in his late 60s, and he was completely devoted to serving everybody in the college, from freshers to the scouts and so on. In case you don't know what a scout is a cleaner at Oxford. Um, so he was very approachable, and he had none of the snootiness or the falsity which sometimes affects men of the cloth. And he wore ordinary clothes unless he was actually conducting worship. And he was like, as though he was the finest possible example of how to be a college chaplain. So I remember my first couple of days in UNIV, and there were loads of sessions. One of them was in the hall, and he introduced himself to the undergraduates and saying to call him Bill. That was it, not Reverend Sykes or something like that, even Reverend Bill. And he did say, "We are not all at it. We're definitely not at it," chuckling away. So I think he had a tin ear for our sense of humour back then. It didn't go down well, but there we are. It was a rare misjudgment for someone who was otherwise very judicious. And he went on to underscore the fact that he was there for everybody, whether they're Christian or not, almost like a social worker or a counsellor or something like that. And he was always a man of his word. So everyone was to feel completely welcome to go to his room to discuss whatever issue there was, and he never broke confidences. And I know some people he used to do that. So he was exceptionally popular, and I can tell you that religion was not a big thing in most people's lives. So he was a sky pilot, but he was also completely down to earth. So I told him it was far too informal that I was to call him Bill and he was to call me George. I say, you have to call me Mr. and my surname, and I'll call you Bill. So he thought that was very droll. So for a while he stuck to that. Anyway, he did everything to involve himself in all aspects of life in the college. And when it came to rugger, he was always there on the touchline supporting us, and likewise with other sports. And the boys' rugby dinner, well, we needed a senior member, as in a Don, and he volunteered to do that. So he was fairly at home with us. He didn't try to be too down with the kids. So it might be difficult for a man in his 60s to be rubbing shoulders with some of us when we were in our teens at our party. There we were. So we could crack risque jokes in his presence without him responding in a way that was very po-faced, or indeed guffawing so loudly that it would strike people as unbecoming. So he didn't try to be youthful. He was usually beaming ear to ear, and he was utterly genuine. So these are some of the many very likable traits he had. He and the head porter, that was Bill Warren, had a ongoing slagging match. There was a running joke between them, this badinage between the two, and each was a foil for the other. So anyway, I remember one time I said something rather foolish in public, a joke I cracked in the Oxford Union, and I happened to pass by the lodge, and the head porter, Bill Warren, said, "Oh, well, I'll have to report you to the chaplain and tell you what you said." So this scowling disapproval was enough to put me in my place. And the chaplain was there, Bill, of course, and he chortled in his usual way, but he didn't ask exactly how I'd supposedly disgraced myself. Anyway, so the head porter was able to use Bill as someone who was completely respectable, but or was there for us in order to shame us into decent behaviour. Bill had this curious toddling gait that was impossible to copy. He was always walking around the college. He was always available like that. In all the years I knew him, and there's about 6 years when I was there, when I went away, when I came back, I never once saw him looking down in the mouth. I never once saw him angry, which is quite extraordinary. So he had élan vital. He was definitely a very positive force in the life of the college. And likewise, I didn't know anyone who had a bad word to say about him. but he wasn't a complete milksop either. I remember there was someone in the college choir, and he wanted not to sing there, and sing in another choir, and he got a choral scholarship, but Bill stood firm. Nope, you are here, or must get the most for the college. He put his foot down on that issue. So he wasn't always meek and mild. He did have a moral backbone. He didn't need to be liked by everybody. So it wasn't just about niceness, if that meant being feeble. And there was another certain beefy boy, I shan't say his name, who was reading chemistry, who would drink himself into, well, I would say a stupor, no, but into rages and be quite frightening. And the only one who could reason with him was Bill. So that was a better way to deal with the situation than the porter having to manhandle this undergraduate out of the bar. Anyway, I remember when a senior civil servant applied to be Master of UNIF in the 90s. There were interviews, and of course Bill was a fellow, and Bill said, will you be supporting the chapel if you get the job? And the man was flabbergasted, and he said, well, my wife and I, we're sort of Christmas and Easter people. But okay, yes, we will go. And Lord Butler of Brockwell was as good as his word, and he attended chapel every Sunday, even though he was not an especially religious person. It was an early morning Sunday service, and those who attended Matins were allowed to have this fabulous cooked breakfast afterwards. So I always did that, and even if I was still drunk from the night before, I would still show up and be swaying in the stalls, but he didn't complain about that. Anyway, his Sunday evening services were always packed. There was every seat was taken. And his sermons were to the point, and they were not self-indulgent. So he had all these virtues, but the trouble is, a clergyman often likes the sign of his own voice overmuch and drones on too long. So he didn't pontificate, he wasn't judgmental, and too much biblical scholarship is soporific. So he didn't inflict that on us, and his carol services were fabulous. So I went to Crumpet Tea on countless occasions because when my first week was bombarded with information and there was too much to take in, and I forgot about a lot of things. Because in my second year I even realised what Crumpet Tea was Wednesday afternoon. So he was bonhomous as usual, and he never talked down to us, even though he was old enough to be my grandfather. So occasionally it was just myself and Bill there. We'd talk about all sorts of topics about his time in the Gurkhas, because I didn't go into his background. He's from Worksop in Nottinghamshire, and his family were solicitors, and he was head boy of Worksop College. And then he had to do national service. He got to be an officer in the Gurkhas. He learned Gurkhali, which is a Nepalese language. He served in Malaya, and I can't think where else. Then he came to Oxford. He was at Balliol. He read law, and then he decided to be a clergyman. He went to Wycliffe Hall, blah, blah, blah. He was ordained an Anglican priest, and he served in Bradford, and he was chaplain of, I think it's University College London, and finally came to UNIF, and he was at UNIF for absolutely years. Something like 27 years. Nobody is anything like that long these days. So we discussed religious topics and whatever else. He was a very broad-minded person, very forgiving, and he would confess to being plagued by doubts regarding the Christian faith. So he had an open door policy, and people would just drop by. And so we would pass the time of day. He was like a shrink, but it was pleasingly devoid of psychobabble. Speaking to him, people could unburden themselves of whatever their anxieties were. So he realised that the role of the chaplain is sometimes simply to listen and not to offer advice. So I wonder if it was galling to hear these often very privileged youths whinging about how unbearable their lives were. But anyway, he didn't complain. He compiled these books, Visions of Joy, Visions of Hope, Visions of Love, blah, 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 with all these marvellous quotations that he'd culled from world literature. And anyway, there were a compendium of these inspiring quotations from every noteworthy writer you can think of. And he had these reflection groups where people would come along and discuss things, and these were very popular indeed. There was a waiting list to go to them. I never joined one, actually. So he was a man with an extraordinarily broad range of literary reference. It's as though every noble nostrum ever written was at his fingertips. So his parishioners were, by definition, brainy and bookish types, so that's why it appealed to them. Bear in mind, most people at the college were aged 18 to 21. So people in that age cohort are usually not the most reflective sorts, but this was an exception. So he was clued up on politics, so he was apolitical. Throughout much of his chaplaincy, the Church of England was a pinko liberal, and that was Days of the Faith and the City Report, which was caning Thatcher. But people of all outlooks felt welcome with him. But I remember him sometimes saying the way that Labour had misused money targeted at their key constituencies, it was disgraceful. So he appeared to regard himself as more of a social worker, and he was completely authentic in his style and genuinely caring about people. And he would write references to people, not actually lie for them. I saw reference he wrote about me, but he once damned with faint praise, which is what I deserve, saying I was not the world's greatest rugby player. So he was not blessed with stature. He was sprightly, and by the time I knew him, he had a very respectable paunch. He had this peerless collection of natty diamond-patterned jumpers. He never married, but he said he was glad that as an Anglican priest he would have had that option. So what else about him? So he often reminisced about his time in the Gurkhas, and obviously he was serving the cause of imperialism, but he said he just didn't give it a moment's thought in those days. That was the way it was. And he often wore his Gurkha tie. It seemed to be the cheeriest chapter of his very full and active life. And when he was at uni, he often used to lead expeditions and go to some chalet in the Swiss Alps. So he did not suffer from the chauvinism or the childish machismo, which some soldiers seem to suffer from. What else can I say? And I often asked about his time in Balliol, and of course it was a very different era when he was there, the late 50s or early 60s, when it was a very cloistered time, and it was an all-boys college at the time. I remember the age of legal majority was 21 back then, and there were women in the university, but boys outnumbered them 8-1, and when he was at Balliol, people had to be back in their rooms by a certain hour, but they were climbing in and out. And he told me about this unfriendly rivalry between Trinity and Balliol, and singing some song over the wall, like Gundawali or something it was, ending a raucous chorus of, thank God I'm not a Trinity man. Anyway, so he didn't become a solicitor, as I said, as his family wanted him to be. He became a priest of the best possible kind. He was never supercilious, as the priests sometimes are. And he didn't seem to possess a passionate faith, but I wonder if he joined the church mainly because he was motivated to assist people, and this seemed the best manner in which he could do that. So he was always effervescent, and he was very attentive to the needs of his flock, and I counted myself as exceptionally fortunate to be one of them. So he very quickly got the measure of people, had to read someone's psychology almost instantaneously. And so he could figure out what made people tick and how to get through to them. And he made a great effort to know each member of the college. Of course, some of them rebuffed him. He gave an invitation to crump tea to absolutely everybody. Some people came once out of politeness, that was it. And there were people like me, freeloaders like me, who came dozens of times. So for some people, it was the start of a lifelong friendship. So he was a walking encyclopedia of college law. And he greatly vivified the life of the college. And this was the Church of England at its caring and genial best. He had just the mildest trace of a Yorkshire accent, which was evident in a phrase like young lads. I remember him saying one time when he was on national service, one of his comrades got married and they came back. And this being the 1950s, sex before marriage was hard to come by. And the other national servicemen were asking this youth, what was it like? What was it like? As in, on the wedding night, he said, well, it was very sweaty. So I wonder if Bill ever got to experience that himself. So he kept in touch with people sometimes for decades after they left. And he knew of former dons who'd been gravely ill, who were immobile, suffering, and he would visit them very often when nobody else would. So he had to handle a lot of grief. Sometimes undergraduates died, even people committed suicide when they were at the college. So Bill had the thankless task of conducting teenage funerals. And obviously that's no easy matter. But anyway, he shouldered this duty valiantly. And he managed to do so with dignity and address the pathos of the situation without hamming it up. and never coming across as disingenuous. So that was the thing about him, is he always pitched it just right, and his indubitable sincerity played very well. So remember in 2005 he finally stood down after such a bravura chaplaincy, and he retired a few miles outside Oxford, so he's able to visit his erstwhile colleagues very frequently. And then in about 2010 I happened to be going down the High, and I saw his unmissable silhouette toddling down the High Street. Now, I could have crossed the road to say hello, but for no particular reason I said, I won't bother to say hello. What I didn't know is I would have been saying goodbye. It was the last time I ever saw him, and he died 5 years later. So I always kick myself for that. So, if you're in a similar situation, make the effort. Say hello, you won't regret it. I could have brought a tiny bit more happiness to him that day and to me, but there we are. So Bill Sikes is sorely missed. He was a wonderful chap, and I wish there were paradise and an afterlife. I don't believe that there is, but if there is, he's up there, I suppose, preparing crumpets for everyone. He had this chummy and angelic smile. He was full of benevolent mischief. He was a man of limitless energy and a buttered crumpet. So when I originally wrote about him, I felt a catch in my voice as I read some of it aloud. He was avuncular, but also a younger brother figure sometimes. So I dearly wish there is a heaven for him to go to.